Okay, let's dive in. Imagine for a second a place where this ancient Christian tradition, I mean, we're talking almost 2,000 years old,
Mm-hmm.
faced wave after wave of pressure, stuff that fractured it, reshaped its identity over, well, centuries.
Yeah, and it's not just ancient history buried in books.
Right. It's this vibrant, really complex story that played out, especially in 20th century Thrissur. And it led to, two distinct branches forming from this one ancient community.
The St. Thomas Christians of Kerala.
Exactly. So this deep dive, it's all about that tangled history, the ecclesiastical side of the Chaldean Syrian church and the Syro Malabar church. We want to look at how their unique identities really got solidified in Thrissur with all these external pressures and internal struggles happening.
And we're pulling from some really fascinating sources here, historical accounts, research papers, executive summaries, the lot. Our job for you, the listeners, to kind of unpack all this.
Get to the heart of it.
Yeah, get to the heart of what went down, figure out why these two churches ended up on such different paths, and really see what made Thrissur so important in their stories.
Okay, so where do we start? Let's set the scene. Go right back to the beginning, how Christianity supposedly first arrived in Kerala.
Right, the tradition. It's central to the St. Thomas Christians, this idea that the Apostle Thomas himself landed way back in 52 AD.
At Cranganore, Buziris, as it was known then.
Precisely. And established those very first Christian communities. They became known as the Nazranis, St. Thomas Christians.
And they had this incredibly deep, early connection, didn't they?
Yeah.
To the East Syrian church.
Absolutely. Liturgy, the language they used, Syriac, Aramaic, even their bishops, for centuries, came all the way from Persia, from Babylonia.
Right up until the late 1500s.
Yeah, that's a long, long connection. And Thrissur, it wasn't just some minor town in this picture. The material points to a really significant East Syriac presence there early on.
Like those 52 Chaldean families settling in 1796.
Exactly that. And the founding of the Marth Mariam Chaldean Church in 1814, noted as the oldest church in Thrissur. So you see this deep East Syriac root right there in the city for a long time.
It's pretty amazing thinking about a tradition stretching back that far. But as the sources show, this connection, the very foundation, it later becomes a real point of conflict, doesn't it?
It does, and that's largely down to external pressures, specifically the arrival of the Portuguese missionaries starting around 1498.
And they weren't subtle about it.
No, the accounts describe their efforts to Latinize the community as, well, pretty aggressive, imposing Latin rites, actively blocking East Syrian bishops from even reaching Kerala.
Which all kind of came to a head in 1599, right? The Synod of Diamper.
A critical moment. Basically, the local clergy were forced, more or less, to reject the authority of the Chaldean Catholic Patriarch back east and adopt these Latinized ways of worship and church structure.
It wasn't just about prayers, was it? It was about control.
Absolutely. Control over their identity, their ancient heritage. And the resistance to this really boiled over in 1653 with the Cunan Cross Oath.
A powerful symbol.
A huge act of defiance. A large part of the community swore they wouldn't obey the Latin hierarchy anymore. They wanted their Syriac right back. The material calls it a major schism.
But this resistance, defining as it was, it didn't exactly lead to a single unified front against the Latin influence, did it? The sources suggest it actually fragmented things further.
That's a crucial point. It actually set the stage for the later divisions we're focusing on today.
How so?
Well, after the Cunan Cross Oath, the community essentially split. You had the Pazai Kutukar, the old party. They eventually returned to communion with Rome.
And they became the foundation for the Syro Malabar Church we know today.
Right. Importantly, keeping the East Syriac liturgy, though, heavily influenced by Latin ways at that time.
And the other group?
The Puthin Kutukar, the new party. They went a different way, aligning with the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Jacobites, and they adopted the West Syriac Rite and its theology.
Okay, but our focus today is really on that old party lineage, right? Because it leads to both the Syro Malabar Church and this other distinct group, the Chaldean Syrian Church.
Exactly. Emerging from that same heritage, but taking a fundamentally different path.
And Thrissur. This is where it gets really interesting. It wasn't just a backdrop. It was a key stage, a hub.
A crucible, really.
Yeah, a crucible where both these expressions of that ancient East Syriac heritage, the Syro-Malabar within the Catholic structure, and the Chaldean Syrian, looking outside Rome for its connections, they were both actively present, shaping their identities, sometimes competing.
Thrissur became the place where consolidating Catholic identity and reasserting a specific non-Roman East Syriac identity happened side by side.
Okay, let's unpack the Syro-Malabar side first. Their 20th century story seems to be about carving out autonomy, but within the Catholic Church.
That's right. After centuries under direct Latin bishops, Pope Leo III made a crucial move in 1887. He essentially separated the Syro-Malabarians from direct Latin jurisdiction.
And Thrissur was immediately significant.
Right at the forefront. It was chosen as one of the very first apostolic vicariates just for Syro-Malabarians in that same year, 1887. That designation alone shows its importance for their emerging structure.
So a step towards self-governance.
A big step. And then another came in 1896, when they started appointing indigenous Syro-Malabar bishops to lead these vicariates, Thrissur included, moving away from foreign control.
And this structure got formalized later.
Yes, in 1923, under Pope Pius XI, the sources mention the formal establishment of the Syro-Malabar hierarchy. Ernakulam became the main center, the metropolitan see.
And Thrissur.
Thrissur became what's called a suffragan eparchy, basically a diocese reporting to the metropolitan in Ernakulam. So this brought the whole church under its own unified local hierarchy.
Were there other changes, like in worship?
There were efforts, yes. Ongoing liturgical reform, trying to bring back more of the original Oriental feel. Changes were approved in 57, introduced in 62.
And the journey culminated much later, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. A major milestone was 1992. Pope John Paul II elevated the Syro-Malabar Church to a major archiepiscopal Syrian church. That's a mouthful, but it means significant self-governing rights, all while staying fully part of the Catholic communion.
But there's a catch, isn't there? The sources mention tension.
There is. Here's a key insight. Even with this jurisdictional autonomy from Latin authorities, those deep-seated Latin influences, particularly on liturgy and practices, they didn't just vanish.
So they remained a point of friction.
Exactly. A source of internal debate, conflict even, an ongoing struggle over what their true identity should look like. You often hear that description, Indian in culture, Christian in faith, and Syriac in liturgy.
Right.
But that Syriac part, the material suggests, was still very much a work in progress, a process of restoration, of trying to peel back the layers of Latinization.
So fascinating. Even as they built this impressive structure and gained autonomy, that internal debate, how much Syriac, what kind of Syriac kept going.
And it profoundly shaped their identity. And, by presenting one way of preserving heritage within Rome, it also kind of influenced the whole landscape for other related groups.
Okay, now let's switch tracks to the Chaldean Syrian church. Their path was fundamentally different, wasn't it? They aimed for direct ties to the ancient Church of the East, outside Rome altogether.
Completely different trajectory. And their modern formation is really linked to events in the late 19th century, specifically around a figure named Mar Elias Melis.
Melis. He arrived in 1874, sent by the Chaldean Catholic Patriarch, who was actually in communion with Rome then. But crucially, Melis didn't have the Pope's okay.
Right. His mission was basically to bring the East Syriac Rite Christians in Malabar under his wing. And significantly, he found a strong base of support where?
Thrissur, operating out of Our Lady of Dolores Church.
Exactly. The material specifically mentions the Syrian Christians, popularly known as the Surais, in and around Thrissur, who owe allegiance to the Syrian historian Patriarch, are the followers of the schism Melis created. This shows there was already a local desire, right there in Thrissur, to reconnect with a more traditional East Syriac authority, separate from the Roman setup.
But Melis didn't stay.
No, Rome eventually excommunicated him, and he left Malabar. But crucially, not all his followers went back to the Syro-Malabar fold.
This is key, isn't it?
Absolutely. While many did return, the sources say a significant minority, maybe around 8,000 people, stuck to their guns. They persisted.
And this group became the core of the Chaldean Syrian church.
Precisely. Initially led by Mar Abdisha Thandanat, they explicitly chose to affiliate with the ancient Church of the East, establishing themselves completely outside the Catholic communion. So ironically, the Melis episode, which started within a Catholic context, ended up being the catalyst for this independent community forming.
And then came Mar Abimelech Timotheus,
the key figure for consolidation. He arrived in Thrissur in 1908, sent directly by the Patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the East, Shimon 19.
And he's credited with bringing stability.
Yes. After years of struggle, he actively worked to revive the authentic East Syriac rites and teachings. His goal was clear: restore the church to how it was before the Synod of Diamper, before the Latinization.
And this led to a legal battle. This seems really important.
Hugely important and fascinating, because it wasn't a fight between the Chaldean Syrians and the Syro-Malabars. It was an internal battle within the Chaldean Syrian community itself.
from 1911 to 1925.
That's the one. Marby Malek Timotheus versus a figure named Chorepiscopa Michael Augustine.
What was the fight about?
Essentially, Augustine resisted Timotheus's reforms. He argued the church should just stick with the existing local customs, not change anything, basically pushing back against the effort to revive the older East Syriac traditions.
So, a fight over the very soul of their identity, restoration versus local custom.
Exactly. And Timotheus won the case in 1925.
Which had massive implications.
Massive.
Yeah.
Because this is where the secular legal system dramatically intersects with church identity. Winning this internal dispute in the civil courts wasn't just about, say, who owned a building, though that was part of it.
It secured the Marth Miriam big church property for them, right?
Yes, but more than that, the ruling legally allowed Timotheus to consolidate the community as an independent congregation. It gave them secular legal backing for their distinct identity, their autonomy, separate from any other group. It shows how using the civil legal system became a crucial tool for defining and securing a religious community space.
Wow. So the courts played a defining role.
In this case, yes. But even after that consolidation, the challenges didn't stop. There were more internal disputes.
Like the one in 1964.
Right. The material mentions a significant conflict involving Martama Darmo, who was the metropolitan in Thrissur then. Issues came up, things like hereditary succession and church leadership, proposed changes to the church calendar.
And this led to another split.
It did. The patriarch suspended Darmo, but Darmo didn't accept it. This caused a split within the Thrissur Chaldean Syrian community itself. Some followed Darmo. He later went on to head the ancient Church of the East. Others remained loyal to the original patriarchate, the Assyrian Church of the East.
So even after consolidating, that process of defining identity, it just kept going.
It shows it's never really finished, is it? Identity negotiation is ongoing.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit.
Yeah.
Looking at 20th century Thrissur, the relationship between these two churches, the Chaldean Syrian and the Syro Malabar,
Yeah.
it wasn't mainly about them suing each other directly.
Not primarily, no. The sources suggest it was more about their fundamentally separate paths, even though they started from the same ancient roots. Their different affiliations, Rome versus the Church of the East, their own internal fights over identity.
And maybe an unspoken competition. For followers, for historical legitimacy.
Exactly. You could say the case here isn't one specific lawsuit between them, but this whole continuous process of defining themselves, often in contrast to each other, playing out right there on the ground in Thrissur.
The Melis aftermath certainly involves some direct, though maybe not legal, competition for who belonged where.
Definitely. And their different affiliations just naturally created different claims to being the true heirs of the St. Thomas Christian tradition.
And Thrissur was the stage for all this. It was the metropolitan seat, the site of that key legal battle for the Chaldean Syrians.
And at the same time, it was the first apostolic vicariate, a foundation stone for the Syro-Malabar Church's structure. Their side-by-side presence just made Thrissur the place where these separate stories unfolded and sometimes, inevitably, rubbed up against each other.
The material also mentions the 1921 Thrissur riot. Not a church conflict itself, but maybe context.
Important context, yeah. It highlights the broader social and religious tensions simmering in the city at the time, an environment these churches were navigating as they solidified who they were.
So Thrissur wasn't passive ground. It was an active crucible where these bigger schisms and reforms took shape locally, sorting out who belonged where and really cementing the identities of these two distinct communities.
And it really brings up that fascinating question. How did dealing with both religious authorities, popes, patriarchs, and the secular legal systems, British courts, princely state courts, how did that dual navigation actually help them define and secure their identities?
The legal battles, even the internal ones, clearly had huge implications for recognition, for consolidation.
Absolutely.
So looking at today, what are the lasting legacies of this century of change in Thrissur?
Well, the clear outcome is these two well-defined, consolidated denominations. The Chaldean Syrian Church today operates as the Indian Archdiocese of the Assyrian Church of the East, which is based in Iraq. It's a smaller community, but it represents that direct historical link.
And the Syro-Malabar Church?
Now, the largest St. Thomas Christian group, and globally, the third largest self-governing sui juris Catholic Church, they play a very prominent role in Indian Christianity.
What strikes you most about this whole story, looking back?
You know, what the material really brings home is the incredible resilience, the adaptability of that St. Thomas Christian identity. Think about it. Centuries of external pressure trying to change them, major internal splits.
Yet they survived.
Not just survived, but managed to consolidate these distinct identities in the 20th century. It wasn't really about one group winning some final battle. It was more like different parts of the same family asserting their own vision for how to best carry forward their heritage, even if that meant going separate ways.
And it's not over, is it? The sources make that clear. Identity formation is still happening.
Absolutely. The Syro Malabar Church is still debating liturgical reforms, de-Latinization. The Chaldean Syrian Church dealt with those internal splits we mentioned. History keeps shaping the present.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That identity, whether it's religious or community-based, it's not some fixed thing set in stone.
Not at all. It's dynamic. It's an ongoing conversation with the past, with external forces, with internal disagreements.
So the big takeaway, what should listeners chew on?
I think it's that this story in Thrissur, the case between these two churches, it's much bigger than just jurisdiction or property. It's this profound narrative of two parts of one ancient family making really different choices.
Choices about how to navigate centuries of pressure, internal debates. One chose communion with Rome, but fought to restore its own character within that.
While the other committed fully to the ancient Church of the East, determined to preserve tradition outside the Roman structure.
The resilience is remarkable.
Truly remarkable. The way this St. Thomas Christian identity endured, even through fragmentation and diversification, it just shows that history isn't just done and dusted. It's alive. It shapes who we are right now.
Something to think about, maybe. How do those external pressures or even internal disagreements shape the identity of any community you belong to? Religious, cultural, professional, whatever.
Yeah, over time.
How much of that historical negotiation, those past choices, might still be influencing things today, perhaps in ways we don't even consciously recognize?
Good question to ponder.
We hope you found some valuable insights in this deep dive.